The hegemony had been running the galaxy like a particularly exclusive country club for the better part of 3 millennia. And frankly, they were getting quite good at it. 47 species had managed to agree on everything from trade protocols to bathroom etiquette across 17,000 star systems, which was either a testament to diplomatic brilliance or proof that bureaucracy was indeed a universal constant. Humans, naturally, had been the last to receive an invitation to this cosmic dinner party, not because they were unworthy, perish the thought, but because they had the unfortunate habit of asking uncomfortable questions like why do the Zalithians get 3 votes when they only control 2 systems? And has anyone actually read the fine print on these mining rights contracts? The kind of questions that made ancient civilizations shift uncomfortably in their crystalline seats and mutter about cultural integration periods. The current arrangement suited everyone just fine. Thank you very much. The Vorthak provided military strategy with the cold precision of beings who had been perfecting warfare since before Earth had figured out agriculture. The Hegemony Council's senior partners handled diplomacy with species so advanced they communicated in mathematical theorems and spoke in frequencies that could shatter lesser minds. The humans? Well, they handled logistics and maintenance and those tedious supply runs that nobody else wanted to bother with. It was a perfectly sensible division of labor, really. Humans were naturally suited for the grunt work. They bred quickly, complained efficiently, and had an inexplicable fondness for fixing things that weren't technically broken yet. Their vessels reflected this utilitarian approach. Blocky, functional ships that prioritized cargo space over elegance, equipped with enough redundant systems to make a Vorthak engineer weep tears of confused admiration. The war against the Devourers had been dragging on for 6 standard cycles now, which was precisely 5 cycles longer than the hegemony's initial projections had suggested would be necessary. The Devourers, it turned out, had not consulted these projections before deciding how quickly they should be defeated. Most inconsiderate of them, really. These particular galaxy-threatening entities had emerged from the void between spiral arms with all the diplomatic nuance of a solar flare and roughly the same temperature. They consumed energy in all its forms. Stellar radiation, planetary cores, the occasional unfortunate starship that wandered too close, converting it into more of themselves with the mechanical efficiency of a cosmic copying machine stuck on permanent reproduction mode. The hegemony's response had been swift, decisive, and utterly conventional. Massive dreadnoughts bristling with weapons that could crack moons deployed in textbook formations. Tactical doctrine refined over millennia, applied with mathematical precision. Everything proceeded exactly according to the established military protocols that had served the galaxy so well against more reasonable enemies. The results had been educational. Turns out, beings that fed on energy rather enjoyed being shot at with energy weapons. Who could have predicted such a thing? The Devourers had responded to each perfectly coordinated assault by growing larger, hungrier, and considerably more interested in whatever delicious energy signatures the hegemony fleets were broadcasting across the Electrum. Admiral Thane, the Vorthak's supreme commander of the 3rd Combined Fleet, had adapted to this inconvenience with typical Vorthak logic. If energy weapons fed the enemy, then obviously the solution was bigger energy weapons applied with greater tactical sophistication. The fact that this approach had resulted in progressively larger Devourers was merely data to be incorporated into increasingly complex battle algorithms. The human contingent of the 3rd Combined Fleet watched these developments with the sort of fascination typically reserved for traffic accidents or political campaigns. Their 12 support vessels, officially designated as Logistics and Maintenance Platform Group 7, maintained a respectful distance from the actual fighting while keeping detailed records of ammunition expenditure, casualty report, and the growing number of requisition forms for replacement dreadnoughts. Fleet Admiral Thane's flagship, the Inexorable Consequence, hung in space like a cathedral made of weapons and bad decisions. 3 kilometers of Vorthak engineering excellence. It mounted enough firepower to sterilize a small moon while maintaining artificial gravity fields so precise they could keep a wine glass steady during faster-than-light combat maneuvers. The human ships, by comparison, looked like particularly angular cargo containers that had been fitted with engines as an afterthought. This aesthetic difference reflected deeper philosophical approaches to warfare. The Vorthak viewed battle as an art form requiring perfect timing, elegant formations, and weapons that could punch through reality itself with mathematical precision. Humans viewed battle as a problem to be solved, preferably with whatever happened to be lying around and functioning at the moment. As the third combined fleet prepared for what tactical analysis suggested would be either a decisive victory or a catastrophic defeat, the algorithms were frustratingly unclear on this point. Nobody particularly expected the humans to contribute anything beyond their usual duties of counting munition and complaining about the quality of the recycled air. After all, they were just the support staff. What could possibly go wrong with a battle plan that had worked so well in every previous engagement? The irony, of course, was completely lost on everyone involved. But then again, irony rarely announces itself until it's far too late to do anything useful about it. The bridge of the inexorable consequence hummed with the sort of controlled chaos that military personnel like to call organized efficiency, and everyone else recognized as barely contained panic with better lighting. Holographic displays painted the command center in shifting blues and reds, each color representing various degrees of tactical unpleasantness currently heading their way at significant fractions of light speed. Admiral Thane stood at the center of this technological symphony, his forearms moving across control surfaces with the fluid precision of a conductor, leading an orchestra toward either a crescendo or a complete breakdown. The Vorthak had evolved from pack hunters on a world where hesitation meant becoming someone else's dinner, which explained their species' a remarkable ability to make life-or-death decisions while maintaining perfect posture and an air of casual confidence. Enemy formation holding at 17,000 kilometers, reported the tactical officer, a hegemony veteran, whose species communicated primarily through color-shifting skin patterns. Currently his epidermis displayed the particular shade of amber that translated roughly to "this is deeply concerning, but we're professionals so we'll pretend everything is fine." The Devourers had arranged themselves in what military analysts generously called a formation, though it resembled nothing so much as a swarm of angry wasps that had achieved consciousness and decided to major in applied destruction. Each entity pulsed with absorbed energy from the previous 3 engagements, having grown from merely concerning to absolutely massive in the span of 6 standard hours. Conventional wisdom suggests a focused barrage at maximum range, Thane mused, reviewing tactical projections that managed to be simultaneously highly detailed and utterly useless. Concentrated fire should disrupt their energy absorption patterns long enough to achieve tactical superiority. This was precisely the sort of reasoning that had gotten them into their current predicament. But nobody on the bridge felt particularly inclined to mention this fact. The Vorthak military tradition held that second-guessing a superior officer during active combat was considered poor form, right up there with surrendering and using the wrong fork at formal dinner. The human liaison officer, officially designated as Interspecies Communication Specialist Grade 7, stood at a console that had been diplomatically positioned where she could observe everything while contributing absolutely nothing to the actual decision-making process. Her role in these situations was to nod thoughtfully, take notes and occasionally translate human supply reports into languages that didn't rely heavily on creative profanity. She had been watching the tactical display with the sort of expression typically seen on accountants reviewing particularly creative expense reports. The mathematics of the situation were, in human terms, completely insane. Each engagement was feeding the enemy exactly what they needed to become stronger, which struck her as the sort of strategy that worked better in abstract philosophy than in practical applications involving things that wanted to eat entire star systems. "Admiral," she ventured, "the supply calculations suggest that our current engagement protocols are producing a net energy gain for hostile forces of approximately." "We are aware of the tactical paradox," Thane interrupted with the patient tone reserved for explaining obvious things to well-meaning subordinates. "However, the hegemony's military doctrine clearly states that retreat in the face of inferior forces constitutes a failure of command integrity." The fact that the forces in question had grown considerably less inferior over the course of 6 engagements was apparently beside the point. Military doctrine was military doctrine, and 3,000 years of successful galactic peacekeeping couldn't be wrong about something as fundamental as how to shoot at problems until they stopped being problems. The attack commenced with all the precision and effectiveness that advanced civilization could bring to bear against an enemy that had evolved specifically to weaponize the very concept of being attacked. Lance beams that could carve through asteroids struck devourer forms and were absorbed with what could only be described as enthusiasm. Missile barrages designed to overwhelm defensive systems instead provided a delightful energy buffet that the entities consumed with visible appreciation. Each hit made them larger, Each larger form absorbed the next hit more efficiently. The tactical display began showing energy readings that made the bridge crew exchange the sort of looks typically reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. The human liaison officer suggested during a brief lull in the catastrophic feedback loop we might consider alternative approaches to the current. The statement was interrupted by an event that military historians would later describe as tactically significant, and everyone else would call absolutely terrifying. The largest Devourer entity had apparently decided that absorbing energy from a distance was inefficient compared to absorbing it directly from the source. It accelerated toward the inexorable consequence with the sort of purposeful movement that suggested it had just spotted something particularly delicious. Admiral Thane had perhaps 3 seconds to appreciate the elegant irony of being destroyed by an enemy that had grown powerful enough to destroy him specifically because he had been trying to destroy it. In those 3 seconds he managed to issue exactly one order. All ships, evasive. The bridge lighting shifted from organized chaos to absolute chaos as the Devourer entity made contact with the flagship's shield. What followed could best be described as the universe's most efficient energy transfer, conducted at temperatures that turned sophisticated Vorthak engineering into very expensive plasma. The explosion that consumed the inexorable consequence lit up local space with the sort of pyrotechnic display that would have been quite beautiful if it hadn't represented the complete disintegration of 3 kilometers of warship and everyone aboard it. In the aftermath, 46 remaining vessels of various species found themselves in the awkward position of being engaged in active combat while simultaneously being leaderless, confused, and facing an enemy that had just absorbed enough energy to power a small star system for several years. The chain of command, according to hegemony military protocols, should have defaulted to the senior Vorthak tactical officer aboard the remaining dreadnought. Unfortunately, that particular officer was currently dealing with the philosophical implications of having just watched his supreme commander become an impromptu light show. The secondary command protocol suggested defaulting to the Hegemony Council representative, who was busy having what humans would recognize as a nervous breakdown and other species politely termed acute stress recalibration. It was at this precise moment of maximum confusion that the human liaison officer's communication panel chimed with an incoming transmission from the human support fleet. The message was brief, professionally delivered, and contained exactly the sort of practical suggestion that military commanders either loved or court-martialed people for making. This is Commander Hayes of the Logistics Group. I'm assuming Fleet Command. All vessels stand by for new tactical orders. The various alien species represented in the remaining fleet took approximately 12 seconds to process this statement, during which the Devourers continued growing larger and more interested in consuming everything within several light minutes of their current position. It was, everyone would later agree, either the most logical command decision possible, or the beginning of the most spectacular military disaster in galactic history, potentially both. Commander Hayes had spent the better part of 15 years managing supply chains, maintenance schedules, and the sort of logistics nightmares that kept military operations functioning while everyone else focused on the more glamorous business of shooting at things. This experience had provided her with a uniquely practical perspective on warfare. Most battles were won by whoever managed to keep their equipment working longest, fed their people regularly, and didn't run out of ammunition at inconvenient moments. The current tactical situation, as she reviewed it from her position aboard the distinctly unglamorous supply vessel, practical consideration, struck her as the sort of problem that required less theoretical sophistication and more basic pattern recognition. The enemy grew stronger when shot with energy weapons. The hegemony kept shooting them with energy weapons. The enemy kept growing stronger. Even a logistics officer could spot the fundamental flaw in this particular feedback loop. Fleet communication. This is acting Fleet Command, she announced across all channels with the sort of matter-of-fact tone typically reserved for announcing schedule changes or menu modifications. Current tactical doctrine has achieved a 100% failure rate over 6 engagements. We will be implementing alternative approaches immediately. The response from the remaining 46 vessels could be diplomatically described as mixed. The Vorthak tactical officers trained in military traditions that valued precision, and the sort of strategic thinking that looked impressive in historical analyses, found themselves in the deeply uncomfortable position of taking orders from someone whose primary qualification appeared to be an uncanny ability to ensure that toilet paper never ran out on long-duration missions. The Hegemony Council's senior diplomatic representatives, communicating through their species' preferred method of crystalline resonance patterns, transmitted what roughly translated to "This is highly irregular, and we demand an immediate review of command authority protocols." The subharmonics suggested they were also thinking several unprintable things about human presumption, military tradition, and the general state of galactic civilization. The crews from the 17 junior partner species responded with the sort of bemused compliance that came from having watched their supposed military superiors achieve spectacular failure through the rigorous application of advanced tactical doctrine. If the humans wanted to try something different, well, it could hardly produce worse results than what they had just witnessed. "All vessels cease fire immediately," Hayes continued, studying the tactical display with the sort of analytical approach she typically applied to supply requisition forms. The Devourers were currently arranged in what could generously be called a formation, having grown from relatively modest energy parasites to entities that registered on sensors as small stellar phenomena. "We will be implementing kinetic engagement protocols exclusively." This statement produced approximately 15 seconds of confused silence across the fleet communication network, followed by the sort of overlapping chatter that indicated multiple species were simultaneously trying to explain why this was either brilliant or insane. The Vorthak officers pointed out that kinetic weapons were primitive, inefficient, and unsuited for modern space combat. The diplomatic representatives noted that kinetic engagement protocols violated approximately 17 different hegemony conventions on civilized warfare. "With respect," Hayes replied in the tone that military personnel universally recognized as meaning with absolutely no respect whatsoever, "civilized warfare conventions appear to be less relevant when facing entities that consider our most advanced weapons to be dietary supplements." The human support fleet had, through what everyone had previously considered unfortunate budget limitations, been equipped primarily with kinetic weaponry, mass drivers, railguns, and the sort of weapons that achieved their effects through the simple expedient of making solid objects move very fast in directions where they would encounter other objects with predictably violent results. These systems were considered somewhat embarrassing by advanced military standards, roughly equivalent to showing up to a formal dinner party armed with a particularly well-crafted club. However, Hayes had spent enough time reviewing engagement reports to notice that kinetic impacts on Devourer entities produced different results than energy weapon strikes. Instead of absorption and growth, solid projectiles seemed to cause structural disruption, temporary confusion, and what the reports diplomatically termed negative tactical response. "Fleet reorganization as follows," she announced, pulling up tactical projections that would have horrified properly trained military strategists. "All dreadnoughts will provide screening and distraction. Cruiser groups will maintain maximum range and draw entity attention through minimal energy discharge. Support vessels will conduct primary assault through concentrated kinetic bombardment." The implications of this command structure dawned on the various fleet commanders with the sort of slow-motion horror typically associated with watching expensive equipment break in an entirely predictable way. The most advanced, heavily armed, technologically sophisticated vessels in the fleet were being relegated to the role of highly expensive decoy. The actual fighting would be conducted by 12 human supply ships that looked like someone had strapped engines to cargo containers and hoped for the best. "This is completely contrary to established tactical doctrine," transmitted the senior Vorthak commander from his position aboard the dreadnought Inevitable Victory, his communication carrying undertones of professional outrage mixed with morbid curiosity. "Yes," Hayes agreed with the sort of patience typically reserved for explaining obvious things to particularly slow children. "Established tactical doctrine has been feeding the enemy for 6 straight engagements. Perhaps it's time to try something that hasn't been proven to make our problems larger and angrier." The human supply fleet began moving into attack formation, which consisted primarily of spreading out enough to avoid hitting each other, while maintaining sufficient coordination to concentrate fire on individual targets. It was the sort of tactical arrangement that would have received failing grades in any respectable military academy, executed by vessels that had been designed for hauling replacement parts and processed food products across interstellar distances. The Devourer entity, apparently sensing some change in the tactical situation, began repositioning themselves with the sort of purposeful movement that suggested they were looking forward to absorbing energy from whatever new weapons the annoying biological entities had decided to deploy against them. They were, Hayes reflected as she watched the tactical display update in real time, about to receive an education in the fundamental differences between feeding on energy and being hit in the face with large pieces of metal traveling at significant percentages of light speed. "All vessels, prepare for engagement," she announced. "Let's show them what uncivilized warfare looks like." The battle that followed would eventually be studied in military academies across 17 species as either a masterclass in adaptive tactical thinking or a cautionary tale about what happened when supply officers were allowed to make strategic decisions. Possibly both, depending on which academic was doing the analyzing and how much they valued their tenure. Hayes watched the tactical display with the sort of focused attention she typically reserved for inventory spreadsheets that didn't balance properly. The Devourers had arranged themselves in a formation that suggested they were expecting another delicious energy weapon buffet, their biometallic forms pulsing with absorbed power from the previous engagement. They moved with the confident purpose of entities that had learned exactly what to expect from these amusing biological creatures and their predictably destructive toy. "Dreadnought Group, begin harassment protocols," Hayes commanded, settling into the comfortable rhythm of coordinating complex operations under pressure. After 15 years of managing logistics for beings who could start 3 different wars while arguing about lunch preferences, Fleet Command felt refreshingly straightforward. The inevitable Victory and her sister ships opened fire with what could charitably be called minimal energy discharge, carefully modulated to produce maximum attention with minimum nutritional value for the enemy. It was the military equivalent of waving a small snack in front of a hungry predator while carefully avoiding anything that might actually feed. The Devourers responded with predictable enthusiasm, accelerating toward the dreadnoughts with the sort of eager movement that suggested they had been hoping for exactly this sort of tactical development. Their forms began to shift and adapt, preparing to absorb whatever energy the biological entities were planning to provide. "Cruiser groups, maintain screening formation and prepare for evasive maneuvers," Hayes continued, watching as the various alien commanders implemented orders that violated approximately everything they had learned about proper fleet engagement protocol. "Support fleet, initiate primary assault pattern Delta." The human vessels moved into attack formation, with all the grace and elegance of a construction crew arriving at a demolition site. Their kinetic weapons system, originally designed for clearing space debris and occasionally discouraging pirates with more enthusiasm than sense, began targeting the largest Devourer entities with the methodical precision that humans brought to any task involving the systematic application of overwhelming force. The first salvo of tungsten core projectiles struck the lead Devourer entity at roughly 12% of light speed, which was fast enough to convert several tons of exotic matter into very energetic plasma, while maintaining enough solid mass to cause what engineers politely termed catastrophic structural failure. The result was immediately and spectacularly different from every previous engagement. Instead of growing larger and more interested, the struck entity convulsed, fragmented, and began broadcasting distress signals across frequencies that made nearby sensor equipment complain about working conditions. "Well," transmitted the Vorthak tactical commander with the sort of stunned professional appreciation typically reserved for watching someone solve a complex mathematical proof using finger paints. "That was unexpected." The remaining Devourer entities paused in their advance, apparently requiring several seconds to process the novel experience of being hurt, rather than fed. Their formations wavered as they attempted to understand why the usual tactical engagement had suddenly become significantly less pleasant. Hayes took advantage of this confusion to implement what she privately thought of as the accountant's approach to warfare: systematic, thorough, and utterly lacking in dramatic flair. The human support fleet spread out into overlapping fields of fire and began working their way through the enemy formation with the sort of methodical efficiency typically associated with processing paperwork or performing inventory audits. Each kinetic impact produced satisfyingly destructive results. Devourer entities that had spent 6 engagements growing fat on absorbed energy suddenly found themselves dealing with the fundamental physics of large objects, moving very quickly through space, occupied by their various vital systems. The laws of thermodynamics, it turned out, were significantly less negotiable than the feeding habits of exotic entities. Support fleet achieving 73% target elimination, reported the tactical officer aboard the practical consideration, with the sort of professional satisfaction typically reserved for announcing that quarterly reports had been filed ahead of schedule. The surviving Devourer entities began implementing what military analysts would later describe as tactical withdrawal, and everyone else would recognize as running away very quickly. Their retreat lacked the organized precision of proper military maneuvers, resembling more the sort of chaotic departure seen when fire alarms went off during boring meetings. The various hegemony vessels watched this development with the sort of fascinated horror typically associated with watching fundamental assumptions about reality collapse in real time. 47 species had spent millennia perfecting the art of civilized warfare, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for applying overwhelming force with mathematical precision and proper regard for established protocol. 12 human supply ships had just solved the same problem using what amounted to cosmic-scale rock throwing, applied with the sort of practical efficiency that came from spending decades making sure things worked properly despite inadequate funding and impossible deadlines. Fleet commanders, Hayes announced as the last retreating Devourer entity disappeared beyond sensor range. Begin damage assessment and casualty report. And someone please send a message to Hegemony Command explaining that the immediate tactical crisis has been resolved through the application of alternative engagement protocol. The aftermath of the battle resembled nothing so much as a construction site where someone had accidentally solved a complex engineering problem using entirely the wrong tools, but somehow achieved better results than the original specifications had called for. Debris fields marked the locations where entities that had terrorized three-star systems had discovered the hard way that evolution had not prepared them for the experience of being systematically demolished by beings who approached warfare like a particularly aggressive maintenance schedule. The human support fleet began the familiar process of post-engagement cleanup, salvage operations, and the sort of paperwork that followed any military action involving projectiles, explosions, and insurance claim. It was, Hayes reflected as she reviewed preliminary damage assessments, exactly the sort of routine administrative task that made military logistics so deeply satisfying. The only difference was that this time, instead of cleaning up after someone else's victory, they were cleaning up after their own.